expired, most of the indentured settled small farms on the frontier. The southern colonies were about 55% British, 38% black, and roughly 7% German. The Atlantic slave trade preliminarily ceased after 1775 and was outlawed in 1808, although some slaves were smuggled in thereafter. After 1630, the initial areas of settlement had been largely cleared of Native Americans by major outbreaks of measles, smallpox, and bubonic plague, beginning decades before the settlers began arriving in large numbers. The leading killer was smallpox, which arrived in the New World around 1510 to 1530. While the 13 colonies differentiated in how they settled and by whom they had many commonalities, nearly all settled in financially by privately organised British settlers or families using in free enterprise without any significant English royal or parliamentary government support or input. Nearly all commercial activity was run in small, privately owned businesses with good credit both at home and in England, which were essential since they are often cash poor. Most settlements were largely independent of British trade since they grew or made nearly everything they needed. The average cost of imports per household was £5 to £15 per year. Most settlements were created by complete family groups with several generations offering present. The population was typically rural, with close to 80% owning to the land they lived and farmed on. After in 1700, as the Industrial Revolution progressed, more of the population started to move to cities, much like that had happened in Britain. Initially, the Dutch and German Americans primarily spoke dialects brought over from Europe, while English was the main trade language. Governments and laws preliminarily occupied the English. The only major British institution to be abandoned was the aristocracy, noted by nearly universal absence. The settlers generally established their own popularly elected governments and courts on as many levels as they could, and were nearly all within years self-governing, self-supporting, and self-replicating. This self-ruling pattern became so ingrained that almost all new settlements would have their own government up and running shortly after arrival for the next 200 years. After the colonies were initially settled, their population growth was made up almost entirely of natural growth, with foreign-born immigrant populations rarely exceeding 10%, except in isolated instances. The last significant colonies to be settled, primarily by immigrants, were Pennsylvania in 1680s, the Carolinas 1663, and Georgia 1732. Even here, the immigrants came mostly from England and Scotland, with the exception of a large Germanic contingent to Pennsylvania. Elsewhere, internal American migration from other colonies provided all the settlers for each new colony or state. Populations grew by 80% at a 3% natural annual growth rate sustained over a 20-year interval. Over half of all new British immigrants to the south initially arrived as indentured servants. They were mostly poor young people who couldn't afford to work in England and couldn't afford passage to America. In addition, about 60,000 British convicts were transported to the new British colonies in Georgia in the 18th century. Most of these so-called convicts were guilty of being very poor and out of work. Serious criminals were generally executed. Ironically, these convicts were often the only immigrants with nearly complete immigration records, as other immigrants typically showed up with few or no records. Although Spain set up few forts in Florida, notably San Agustin, present-day St. Augustine, in 1565, they sent few settlers to Florida. Spaniards moving north from Mexico founded San Juan on the Rio Grande in 1598 and Santa Fe in 1607 to 1608. The settlers were forced to leave temporarily for 12 years, 1680 to 92, by Pablo revolt before returning. Spanish Texas lasted from 1690 to 1821, when Texas was governed as a colony which was separate from New Spain. In 1731, Canary Islanders arrived to establish San Antonio. The majority of the few hundred Texan and New Mexican colonizers in the Spanish colonial period were Spaniards and Criollos. California, New Mexico, and Arizona all had Spanish settlements. In 1781, Spanish settlers founded Los Angeles. At the time, they joined the U.S. Californios in California numbered about 10,000 and the Chicanos in Texas about 4,000. New Mexico had 47,000 Spanish settlers in 1842. Arizona was only thinly settled. However, not all these settlers were of European descent. As in the rest of the American colonies, new settlements were based on the casta system, and although all could speak Spanish, it was really a melting pot of whites, native, and mestizos. In the late 17th century, French expeditions established a foothold on the St. Lawrence River, Mississippi River, and the Gulf Coast. Interior trading posts, forts, and cities were thinly spread throughout Louisiana, such as the St. Louis, Baton Rouge, Sault Ste. Marie, Prairie du Rocher, and Saint Genevieve. The city of Detroit was the third largest settlement in New France. New Orleans expanded, where several thousand French-speaking refugees from the region of Arcadia, now Nova Scotia in Canada, made their way to Louisiana following British expulsion, settling largely in the southwest Louisiana region now called Arcadia. Their descendants are now called Cajun and still dominate the coastal areas. It is estimated that 7,000 European immigrants settled in Louisiana during the 18th century. There was relatively little immigration from 1770 to 1830, while there was significant emigration from the US to Canada, including about 75 loyalists, as well as Germans and others looking for better farmland in what is now Ontario. Large-scale immigration resumed in the 1830s from Britain, Ireland, Germany, and other parts of Central Europe, as well as Scandinavia. Most were attracted by cheap farmland. Some were artisans and skilled factory workers attracted by the first stage of industrialization. The Irish Catholics were preliminary unskilled workers who built a majority of canals, railroads, settling in urban areas. Many Irish went to the emerging textile mill towns of northeast, while others became longshoremen in the growing Atlantic and Gulf port cities. Half the Germans headed to farms, especially in the Midwest, with some to Texas, while the other half became craftsmen in urban areas. Nativism took the form of political anti-Catholicism, directly mostly at the Irish as well as Germans. It became important briefly in the mid-1850s in the guise of the Know Nothing Party. Most of the Catholics and German Lutherans became Democrats, and most of the other Protestants joined the new Republican Party. During the Civil War, ethnic communities deported and supported the war and produced large numbers of soldiers on both sides. Riots broke out in New York City and other Irish and German strongholds in 1863 when a draft was instituted, particularly in light of the provision exempting those who could afford payment. Based on available records, immigration totaled 8,385 in 1820, with immigration totals gradually increasing to 23,322 by the year 1830. For the 1820s decade, immigration more than doubled to 1,430. And between 1831 and 1840, immigration more than quadrupled to a total of 599,000. These included about 207,000 Irish starting to immigrate in large numbers following Britain's easing of travel restrictions, and about 152,000 Germans, 76 British and 46,000 French, constituting the next largest immigration group of the decade. Between 1841 and 1850, immigration nearly tripled again, totaling 1,713,000 immigrants, including at least 781,000 Irish, 430,000 Germans, 267,000 British, and 77,000 French. The Irish, driven by the potato famine of 1845 to 49, emigrated directly from their homeland to escape poverty and death. The failed revolutions of 1848 brought many intellectuals and activists to exile in the US. Bad times and poor conditions in Europe drove people out, while land, relatives and freedom, opportunities and jobs in the US lured them in. Starting in 1820, some federal records, including ship passenger lists, were kept for immigration purposes, and a gradual increase in immigration was recorded. More complete immigration records provided data on immigration after 1830. Though conducted since 1790, the census of 1850 was the first in which place of birth was asked specifically. The foreign-born population in the US likely reached its minimum around 1815 at approximately 100,000, or 1% of the population. By 1815, most of the immigrants who arrived before the American Revolution had died. There had been almost no new immigration thereafter. Nearly all population growth up to 1830 was by internal increase. Around 98% of the population was native-born. By 1850, this shifted around 90% native-born. The first significant Catholic immigration started in the mid-1840s, shifting the population from around 95% Protestant down to 90% by 1850. In 1848, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo concluded the Mexican War, extended U.S. citizenship to approximately 60,000 Mexican residents in the New Mexican Territory and 10,000 living in California. An additional approximate 2,500 foreign-born Californian residents also became U.S. citizens. In 1849, the California Gold Rush attracted 100,000 would-be miners from eastern U.S., Latin America, China, Australia and Europe. California became a state in 1850 and with a population around 90,000. Between 1850 and 1930, about 5 million Germans migrated to the United States, peaking between 1881 and 1885, when 1 million Germans settled primarily in the Midwest. Between 1820 and 1930, 3.5 million British and 4.5 million Irish entered America. Between 1845, most Irish immigrants were Protestants. After 1845, Irish Catholics began arriving in large numbers, largely driven by the Great Famine. After 1880, larger steam-powered ocean-going ships replaced sailing ships, which resulted in lower fares and greater immigrant mobility. Meanwhile, farming improvements in southern Europe and the Russian Empire created surplus labour. Young people between the ages of 15 to 30 were predominant among newcomers. This wave of migration, constituting the third episode in the history of US immigration, may be better referred to as a flood of immigrants, as nearly 25 million Europeans made the long trip. Italians, Greek, Hungarians and Poles and other speaking Slavic languages made up the bulk of this migration. 2.5 to 4 million Jews were among them. Each group envisaged a distinctive migration pattern in terms of gender balance within the migration pool and the prominence of their migration, their literacy rates, the balance between adults and children, and the like. but they shared one overarching characteristic. They flocked to urban destinations and made up the bulk of the US industrial labour pool, making possible the emergence of such industries as steel, coal, automotive, textile and garment